saved in a separate file that is separate from the PDF itself. I'm not sure whether it is available for Microsoft Windows. It might be. Okay, there's a good chance it is also available for Windows. But I personally just think that this is a really cool tool to use for classes like this. Where the notes is already electronically available. So I'm not going to save this one, because I'm just using it to demonstrate other stuff. So are there any questions about, the swap example of how to use passing by reference? No questions? Let's move on to another example. Okay. So this other example that I have is going to be factorial again. In other words, we are using factorial kind of like a benchmark program. In other words, we look at factorial at the beginning when we first talk about subroutines. We looked at it again when we talked about local variables. We looked at it again when we look at by val parameters, and now we look at it again when we look at by ref parameters. So we'll say define subroutine factorial, and then we'll say by val n is still being passed by value, and then by ref r, the result is passed by reference. The code is now a little bit less cumbersome than before, because we can say if n is less than or equal to 1, then r gets a value of 1. Else, we have to first invoke factorial again, and this time using n minus 1 to specify n, and then we use r to specify r. And then when it comes back, and when we return from this subroutine, then we say r gets r times n, and if n define sub. In my main program, what I would do is I will say x, invoke factorial. This time I want to find a factorial of 3, which is just like most of my other examples using factorial. And I want to store the result into x, which is a global variable, and print it out later. Okay, so that's my program. We want to trace the program just to find out what it does and how it does it. Are there any questions about the source code itself? The code. No questions about the code itself? Okay. Let's go ahead and trace it. And before that, let's save the file first into today's folder. There we go. We do need a comments column because there's one single conditional statement. We need a line number, and there's still a global variable x. I could have gotten rid of the global variable x in this case, but we'll just kind of let it stay here. The precondition is we don't need to know anything about x. That's kind of interesting because I don't see anywhere in this code that we will initialize the variable x. So is that really going to be okay if I leave global variable x uninitialized completely? We'll find out. We'll find out because the passing by reference mechanism will in the end initialize the variable x. So we'll find out exactly how it does it and how it will keep changing variable x as the subroutine goes on doing its own thing. We start with line 11, which is invoking factorial, which means we have to reserve a column for return line number. We have to reserve one for r and one for n, just like that. The return line number in this case is not post because line 11 is followed by line 12, so the return line number is line 12. This is to remind ourselves when we are done with the subroutine, where do we go to continue execution. N is passed by value, which is easy because we just have to look at the expression 3 and say, what is the value of 3? Well, the value of 3 is 3, and as a result, n starts with the value of 3. Not a problem. The question is, what do I use to specify parameter r? I use variable x to specify parameter r. X lives in column C. That makes r an alias of the same column. So r is also known as column C. Do we have any questions about this part? How we set up a by-ref parameter? No questions? Okay. Then we'll go into the subroutine. Every time you invoke a subroutine, you have to start from the very first line of the algorithm of the subroutine, which in this case is line 4. Line 4 is asking n is less than or equal to 1. Is it true or is it false at this point? It's false because n has a value of 3. So we go to the else portion. We go to line 7, which is the one line after the else in the pseudocode. And it tells me that I have to invoke factorial again. Fine. Okay, we have to set up the same 3 columns again, but this time I have to use new columns. I will be using column G, column H, and column I for return line number, variable parameter n, and also parameter r. The return line number is going to be line 8 because the invocation is on line 7. N is a little bit mysterious because in this case it seems like we have a chicken and egg problem. We are trying to specify the parameter n, but we are also using n to determine that. Well, it is not confusing at all because these two n's refer to different columns altogether. The n of the n minus 1 on the left-hand side of the arrow refers to the n that we already know, which is referring to column E. Okay? So this n here refers to column E, which is in the current context of the subroutine. The n on the right-hand side refers to the context that I'm setting up, okay, which is not my current context, but the context that is being constructed at this point. So that means there's no problem at all because the n on the left-hand side refers to column E. Column E has a value of 3. 3 minus 1 is 2. What do we do with the value of 2? We put it into the parameter n that we are setting up at this point, which is column H. As a result, column H now has a value of 2. Is that okay? Okay, so it is very important to realize, okay, are we talking about the right-hand side or are we talking about the left-hand side of the arrow? What about R? Now this one is even more mysterious because the current context, which is column D, column E, and column F, has R being an alias of column C already. When we specify column I, which is R, which is passed by reference, by using my R, which is also passed by reference, now we have two logical choices. Okay? Do we want to say that column I is an alias of column F, which means we have an alias of an alias, or do we want to just say column I is an alias of column C? Make it go straight back to the source. Straight back to the source. The more efficient way is actually the correct way as well in this case. So that means in this case, column I is also known as column C. We just pass the alias along in the case of passing by reference something that is already passed by reference to me. Is that okay? If you think about this in the analogy of a library, checking out books and stuff like that, it also makes sense. Because instead of making this a call number of a little strip of paper that is a call number to a book, you might as well just make this one basically the same call number to the same book. Okay? So don't forget, this is actually very, very important. When you pass a parameter that is already passed by reference to you as a subroutine, when you pass it along by reference, you just pass the reference or the alias along. You do not, in this class, make an alias of an alias. Is that okay? Okay, that is important. Okay, now that we have set up the 3 columns, we can continue execution inside the subroutine. And I can use this little mechanism to help me focus on the context that we are in at this point. We go back to line 4 because line 4 is the first line of the subroutine. And it will do pretty much the same thing, trying to find out whether n is less than or equal to 1. And it is false this time because n equals to 2. Okay, this is starting to get a little bit boring. We go to line 7 again. Line 7 is going to invoke factorial again, which means I have to set up the columns pretty much the same way, with one minor difference. The minor difference has to do with n. The return line number is still 8 because the invocation is still on line 7. And in this case will be 2 minus 1, which is 1. Are we okay with this part here? Okay. R, once again, we do not make an alias of an alias. So R in this case is still an alias of the original item. So it's like that. And now this becomes my current context. Once I have the columns all set up, we can start to execute the subroutine starting on line 4 again. On line 4, we look at this, we evaluate this condition. N is less than or equal to 1. This time it is true because n does equal to 1 at this point. That means I don't have to do recursion anymore. I don't have to invoke the subroutine anymore. I go to line 5. Line 5 says it wants to put a 1 into R. But what is R? R is an alias of column C, and as a result, column C itself is updated to a value of 1. Okay? In other words, we are 3 invocations into the subroutines, and yet the subroutine can access the global variable x without actually referring to the name variable x. Are we doing okay so far? Yep. Okay.
So we don't change the value of R?
We do not change the value of R. That is correct. A pass by reference parameter does not change by itself. Okay. When you quote unquote change a parameter that is passed by reference, you change what it is referring to, and you don't change the parameter itself. Okay. And that's why I called it, a wormhole, because when you throw something at a wormhole, the wormhole itself does not get hit by that something. Whatever is on the other side of the wormhole gets hit. Right? I don't want to turn this into a theoretical physics class, but I think most people have enough exposure to sci-fi movies to realize what a wormhole is. Yes or no? Okay. If not, you have to watch, some more movies. Particularly Farscape. Has anyone watched Farscape? Only a few hands. Oh man. In that case, the question is, what do you do? What do you have to do to throw a sun through a wormhole? Not a little rock, an entire sun. Yeah, you got to watch that movie. It's funny. Okay, so now we are done with line 5. Line 5 is the only line of the then portion of the conditional statement. When we are done with it, we have to go all the way out to line 10. And line 10 still does its own thing, which is deallocating all the columns that we have allocated for this invocation, including parameter R. But when you deallocate column L or parameter R, nothing happens to column C, because parameter R is nothing more than an alias of column C. In other words, you can destroy the alias all you want. It does not have any impact whatsoever on the column that it refers to. Is that okay? Okay. And the return line number also tells me I have to go back to line 8, but columns J, K, and L are no longer my current context. I have to switch back to column column G, H, and I are now my current context.